My name is Claire Hartley, and I am 36 years old. I have been a licensed estate attorney for 9 years. I have sat across tables from grieving families in the worst weeks of their lives and helped them understand what their loved ones left behind. I have read wills that divided siblings who had grown up sharing bedrooms. I have read trust documents that reunited people who hadn't spoken in a decade. I have sat beside widows who discovered, only after the funeral, that the financial picture they thought they understood had been something entirely different in practice. I have held those conversations hundreds of times. I know better than most people that money inside a family is never just money. It is a language. It is a declaration. It is a way of saying, in numbers, who matters and who doesn't, who is trusted and who is managed, who is inside the circle and who is allowed to stand near it but never quite enter. I say all of that so you understand something important. When I tell you I missed what was happening in my own marriage for nearly 7 years, I am not telling you a story about being careless or unintelligent. I am telling you a story about being too close to see clearly, about the specific blindness that comes from loving someone, and about what happens when the numbers finally stop adding up. Welcome back to Stillwater Stories, where composed women answer quiet betrayals with documented proof. If you have ever been the reliable one in a room that took advantage of that reliability, this story is going to land somewhere specific. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and let's start from the very beginning. I grew up in a small town called Mill Haven in rural Pennsylvania. Population just under 5,000. One main street with a hardware store, a post office, a diner called the Copper Kettle that had been serving the same chicken pot pie special on Fridays for as long as anyone could remember. Not because it was the best chicken pot pie in the world, but because the owner, a woman named Margaret, believed that consistency was its own kind of kindness, and the town had long since agreed with her. I grew up in a house on Birchwood Lane, a 2-story colonial with white shutters and a garden my mother kept with the same quiet attention she brought to everything she did. She was an elementary school librarian. Not the background kind, the kind who knew every single child's reading level and every child's particular hunger, and exactly which book to press into exactly which pair of hands at the precise right moment. She had a gift for it. She understood that the right story at the right time could reorient a person's life entirely, and she treated that understanding as a professional responsibility she took seriously every single day. My father worked for the county roads department for 31 years. He left the house early every morning, 5 days a week, rain or shine, or the particular Pennsylvania winters that came in hard off the mountains and stayed until March. He came home in the evenings with the honest tiredness of a man who had spent his day fully and wasn't looking for applause about it. He ate dinner, watched the local news, fell asleep in the armchair by the window with his reading glasses still on, and I thought, growing up, that there was something quietly dignified about a life built that steadily without needing anyone to notice. My parents were not wealthy. They were careful. My mother kept a household notebook, green cover, updated every Sunday evening. She tracked every dollar in and every dollar out, not from anxiety, from respect. She had grown up with considerably less than she had as an adult, and she never let herself forget what less felt like, because she believed forgetting was a form of ingratitude she was not willing to practice. I watched her do this from the time I was old enough to understand what the columns meant. I asked her once, maybe when I was 8 or 9, why she kept the notebook when the bank already kept track. She thought about it and then said, "The bank keeps track of what happened. The notebook keeps track of what I decided." I wrote that down in my own notebook later. I have thought about it more times than I can count. I was the first person in my family to go to university. Not because my parents hadn't wanted to, but because their lives had taken the shapes they had taken, and those shapes had been good ones, and they had no particular grief about other roads. For me, the pull was different. I was the kind of child who looked at the world outside Mill Haven with a persistent, alert curiosity, a sense that there was more to understand, and that understanding was available to me if I was willing to go toward it. I applied to Penn State on my own, wrote my own essays, researched the financial aid options myself, and drove to the campus visit without mentioning it to my parents until I had an acceptance letter in my hand. They were proud, in the way people are proud when they didn't ask for the achievement but recognize what it cost. My mother cried. My father shook my hand and then pulled me into a hug that lasted longer than his hugs usually did, and didn't say anything because he didn't need to. I studied pre-law because the architecture of argument made sense to me in the way that stories made sense to other people. A contract, at its core, is simply an agreement written down so no one can pretend later that it said something it didn't. I found that clarifying. I still do. I graduated near the top of my class, passed the bar on my first attempt, and took a position at a mid-size estate planning firm in Philadelphia. I was 24 years old, 300 miles from Millhaven, and I believed entirely that the work would be enough. Then I met James Whitfield. He came into our office as the executor of his late uncle's estate. He was 32, tall, with the particular ease of someone who had grown up being told he was exceptional and had, for the most part, lived up to it. He was a commercial architect. He designed buildings that won regional awards. He talked about his work the way I talked about mine, with genuine love for the problem itself rather than for the recognition the solution brought. We had coffee after his second appointment. We had dinner after his third. By the time the estate was fully settled, we were together. I want to say that I noticed the family early. I did notice things. I noticed that James spoke about his mother, Margaret Whitfield, with a particular kind of deference that was different from the way he spoke about anything else in his life. With everything else, he was direct and considered and willing to examine his own position. With his mother, there was a smoothness, a frictionlessness that felt less like love and more like a very old and very well-maintained habit. I noticed that when we drove to his parents' house in Chestnut Hill for the first time, he sat slightly straighter in the car as we got closer, in the way people do when they are preparing to be assessed rather than welcomed. I noticed that his mother, when she opened the door, looked past me to him first and only brought her eyes to me after she had confirmed something from his expression. I noticed all of these things. I filed them under adjusting to a new family and told myself to give it time. That was the first of many times I would make that particular filing error. James and I married 3 years after we met, in September, at a vineyard outside Philadelphia. 80 guests, a string quartet, white garden roses, and wildflowers that I had chosen from a farm stand in Chester County. The weather was exactly right, the kind of early autumn afternoon that makes Pennsylvania look like a painting of itself. James cried when I came through the doors, which I had not expected and which undid me entirely in the best possible way. His father, Robert, gave a toast that was warm and funny and said my name 4 times in 3 minutes, which I noticed because his wife, Margaret, had given a toast at the rehearsal dinner the night before that had lasted 5 minutes and had not included my name once. Not once. 5 minutes about her son, his childhood, his achievements, the man she was proud to have raised, the future she hoped for him. My name was absent from all of it. I was at the table. I was the reason for the occasion, and I was not in the speech. Robert caught my eye when she sat down. He had a look I would come to know very well over the following years, a helpless, apologetic look. The look of a man who has been watching a pattern for a very long time and has exhausted his available responses to it. He raised his glass slightly toward me. I raised mine back. That was the most honest exchange we had that entire weekend. I told myself she was nervous. I told myself she needed time. I married James the next afternoon, and I was genuinely, completely happy, and I do not want you to lose that in what follows. I loved him. That love was real. It is what makes the rest of it complicated. Margaret Whitfield was not a cruel woman. I want to be precise about that because cruelty would have been easier to name and address. She was something more sophisticated and considerably more difficult to pin down. She was selective. She gave warmth the way a careful person gives expensive gifts, thoughtfully, deliberately, in amounts calibrated to create appreciation without ever creating sufficiency. She was warm to James, always and without reservation. She was warm to her daughter, Carolyn, who was 3 years older than James and who had her mother's precise way of arranging things, so they served a particular purpose while appearing entirely natural. She was warm to the neighbors she had known since the children were small, to the women in her garden committee, to the couple across the street who had been close friends for 30 years. To me, she was something I struggled to name accurately for most of our marriage. The word I eventually settled on, after years of trying to find the right one, was managed. She managed me. She was consistently polite. She was occasionally kind. She remembered my birthday and sent cards that were perfectly chosen and said exactly the right things in exactly the right amounts. But there was always, always a distance. Not a large distance. Nothing you could point to on a single occasion and say, there, that is the thing. That is proof. It was a consistent and carefully maintained gap between where I stood and where the rest of the family stood, and the consistency of it over years is what told me it was not accidental. The introductions were the clearest expression of it. For 7 years, in every social context where Margaret introduced me, she introduced me as James's wife. Not as Claire, not as James's wife Claire, just James's wife, the way you might refer to someone whose name keeps slipping your mind. or whose name you have decided is not the most important piece of information about them. At the garden committee, where I had been attending alongside her for 3 years by the time of which I'm speaking. At the Whitfield family Christmas party, in front of people who had known my name for the full duration of my marriage. At Robert's retirement dinner, in a room of 60 people, many of whom I had spent real time with, real conversations with, real holidays with, and who watched while Margaret introduced me and did not supply my name. James always filled it in afterward. He would say, "Her name is Claire," with a light laugh that was meant to soften the moment. He said this so many times across so many occasions that it became its own kind of sentence. A sentence that said, quietly and without ever being spoken aloud, "This is a pattern we have all agreed not to directly address." Carolyn was subtler. She had none of her mother's surface warmth, which meant she was in some ways more straightforward to read. She was simply slightly cooler than the situation called for, on a consistent basis. She asked about my work occasionally, in the way you ask about something you are not particularly interested in, to perform the asking rather than receive the answer. She remembered details about my life when they were useful to her, and forgot them when they were not. She stood, at family gatherings, slightly closer to her mother than the situation required, a quiet alignment that communicated, without words, where the boundaries of the inner circle were drawn. She was never unkind to me. She was never fully warm either. And in the specific emotional mathematics of a family, where warmth was currency, that neutrality had a cost. I was practicing estate law the whole time. 7 years of sitting across from people and helping them see the structures that had been invisible to them while they were living inside their lives. 7 years of reading documents that told truer stories than the conversations around them had. 7 years of being genuinely good at seeing what other people missed. And inside my own marriage, inside my own family, I was filing everything under "she'll warm up eventually and I just need to give it more time and it's not worth making an issue of it." I have thought about this a great deal since. The specific blindness of loving someone is that it makes you extend to the people adjacent to them a charity you would never extend to strangers. If a client had described Margaret's pattern of behavior to me in a professional context, I would have identified it accurately, within 40 minutes. I would have known what it was, what it meant, and what the person sitting across from me needed to do about it. I knew it for 7 years in my own life and called it something else. That is not stupidity. That is the cost of caring about someone and wanting the people around them to be who you need them to be. It is a very human error. It is also, in my case, the error that allowed something else to go unseen for far too long. In the spring of the 7th year of our marriage, James and I decided to refinance our home. We lived in a house in the Germantown neighborhood of Philadelphia, a 3-bedroom Victorian row house that I had loved from the moment I walked through it, with original hardwood floors and tall windows and a back garden that James had designed himself with the same care he brought to his professional work. We had bought it in the 2nd year of our marriage. The down payment had come from my savings, accumulated across 8 years of careful work, and the particular financial discipline I had learned watching my mother's green notebook on Sunday evenings. We had paid down a meaningful portion of the mortgage, and the interest rate environment had shifted enough to make refinancing genuinely sensible. I started the application on a Tuesday morning in October, while James was at his studio. Routine process. I had assisted clients through similar applications many times. I pulled our financial documents, our tax returns, our joint and individual account statements, and began filling in the relevant fields methodically. The joint account was straightforward. Our individual accounts were straightforward. And then I came to the field for outstanding liabilities, and I found something that was not straightforward at all. There was a line of credit associated with my name that I had not opened. I read the entry again. I checked the account number against my records. I checked the originating institution. I checked the dates. I called the bank directly and spent 11 minutes on hold before a customer service representative picked up and confirmed what I was reading. The account had been opened 4 years ago. It was associated with my name, my social security number, my date of birth, and a mailing address that was not my current address, had not been my address since before my marriage, and was in fact not an address I had ever lived at. The current outstanding balance on this account was $81,000. $81,000, borrowed in my name over 4 years, accumulating interest, leaving a footprint on my financial record, moving through a system with my identity on it, while I had no knowledge of its existence. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that call ended. The coffee I had made that morning was cold beside my laptop. Outside the window, the back garden was doing what James had designed it to do in October. the roses finishing and the ornamental grasses catching the light, and the whole thing looking composed and considered and exactly as intended. I looked at it, and I thought about every piece of paper I had signed in this marriage. I thought about insurance updates and joint filing amendments and the document at Christmas 3 years ago, at Margaret's kitchen table in Chestnut Hill, with the fire going in the next room and carols playing and people talking around me and a glass of mulled wine in my hand, and Margaret appearing at my elbow with a single page and a pen and saying, "It's just the annual family trust update. James needs both signatures. It's entirely a formality. Take your time." I had signed it. I had not read it first. In 9 years of professional practice, I had never signed a document without reading it. That was the one time I had not. I have spent considerable time thinking about the circumstances in which that happened. The warmth of the room, the wine, the music, the social context that made stopping to read carefully feel like a disruption, and about whether those circumstances had been constructed deliberately or had simply been taken advantage of opportunistically. I have not fully resolved that question, but I know what I found when I finally looked. I did not call James. I did not call Margaret. I went to my office, closed the door, and did what I had been trained to do. I requested a full transaction history from the bank, citing my professional standing and my legal right as the named account holder. I requested a copy of the original account application. I logged into every joint financial account James and I maintained and pulled 12 months of statements. I was not at that stage looking for a specific thing. I was mapping the architecture. Start at the beginning, follow every dollar, and let the pattern reveal itself. The pattern revealed itself within the first 2 hours. The line of credit in my name had been opened 4 years ago with an application bearing a signature that closely resembled mine. The mailing address listed on the application was a post office box registered to a company called Whitfield Family Holdings, LLC. I had never heard of Whitfield Family Holdings. I searched the Pennsylvania Department of State Business Registry. The company was registered 4.5 years ago, approximately 6 months before the credit line was opened. The registered agent was Margaret Ann Whitfield. The secondary member was Carolyn Whitfield Chambers, Margaret's daughter. James was not listed. I was not listed. I pulled the full transaction history on the credit line. $81,000, drawn in 8 separate transactions over 4 years, each draw between $7,000 and $14,000. I cross-referenced the draw dates against my personal calendar and against dates I could verify from family records. 4 of the 8 draws had occurred within 10 days of occasions on which I had been present in the Whitfield household and had signed documents I was told were routine administrative matters. The pattern was not coincidental. In forensic financial work, patterns of that specificity are almost never coincidental. They are timing, and timing in financial documents is one of the most legible forms of intent. I sat at my desk for a while after I had mapped the full picture. I was not emotional in that moment, not in the way you might expect. I was in the particular state I enter when I am working a complicated file and the shape of it has just become clear, alert, focused, slightly cold in the way that comes from adrenaline moving through a body that is holding itself still. Then I called Francis Donnelly. Francis was the most trusted colleague I had, 20 years my senior, a forensic accountant who had spent nearly 2 decades working financial crime cases before going into private practice. She had helped me with complex estate matters on 3 separate occasions, and I knew exactly how she worked. I told her what I had found. I told her in the same order I had found it, without editorializing, because Francis did not need editorializing, and because I had learned that the cleaner the initial account, the more useful the response. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for perhaps 5 seconds. Then she said, "Can you get me the full transaction history tonight?" I said yes, she said, "and the corporate registry filing for Whitfield Family Holdings." I said I had already sent it. She said, "Claire?" I said yes. She said, "This is going to take me about a week to map properly, and I need you to do one thing before you speak to anyone in that family." I said, "I know. Talk to a family attorney first." She said, "I mean before you say a single word to anyone." I said, "I know, Francis." I said it a second time. "I know." I hung up. I sat in my office in the building where I spent my professional life helping other people understand what had been taken from them, and I allowed myself for just a few minutes to sit with the weight of what I was looking at. Not for long. There was work to do. But for those few minutes, I let the full shape of it land, because I had learned, across 9 years of this work, that not letting difficult things land was its own kind of problem. Frances called on the ninth day. She had the complete picture. She walked me through it on the phone with the precision I had always admired in her. No excess, no dramatic framing, just the architecture laid out clearly and sequentially so I could see every piece of it. Here is what she found. The credit line in my name had been opened using my personal information obtained through means she could not fully trace from the documentary evidence alone, but that were almost certainly connected to documents I had provided in good faith to the Whitfield family across the years of the marriage: tax returns, insurance forms, joint filings, a property document I had signed at Margaret's house during the third year of the marriage, which I had at the time understood to be related to a family property matter that did not directly involve me. Somewhere in 7 years of administrative family paperwork, at times when I was present and trusting and not reading things carefully, my information had been used to establish a credit line whose proceeds went directly to Whitfield Family Holdings, LLC, and from there into the hands of the two women whose names were on the company registration. The money, $81,000 in total, had moved through 3 destinations. $44,000 had gone toward what the transaction records described as home improvement expenditure on the Whitfield family property in Chestnut Hill. $20,000 had been transferred to a personal account registered to Carolyn Whitfield Chambers. $17,000 had been used for personal spending, including significant retail purchases, restaurant charges, travel expenditure, and a transaction at a jewelry dealer on Walnut Street in Philadelphia that represented by itself the single largest draw on the account. Not $1 of the $81,000 had gone to James. Not $1 had gone to our joint household account or been used for any purpose connected to our marriage. $81,000 borrowed in my name, over 4 years, spent by his mother and his sister on their own lives, while I attended garden committee events and Christmas dinners and was introduced week after week, year after year, as James's wife, as though my name were a detail too minor to retain. I sat with that for the length of a full evening after Frances and I finished the call. James came home, and I made dinner, and we talked about his day and about a project he was in the middle of, a community library renovation in West Philadelphia that he was particularly invested in, and I was present and engaged and asked real questions and felt, underneath all of it, the distance between what I knew and what he knew like a physical presence in the room. I did not know yet whether he had any awareness of what his mother and sister had done. That was the question I carried through every conversation in those days. The question I could not answer until I had spoken to him directly. I did not want to be wrong about him. I also did not want to be naive about him a second time. I had spent 7 years extending charity that was not always warranted, and I was finished with that practice. I needed to see his face when he saw the documents. I needed that information before I made any other decision. I contacted Harriet Bloom the morning after Frances's call. Harriet was a family attorney with an office in Center City, 20 years of experience in matrimonial and financial matters, and a reputation in the Philadelphia legal community for forensic precision that was known and respected by everyone in the field adjacent to mine. I sent her Frances's full report before our first meeting. I walked into her office on a Thursday afternoon with every document organized, every transaction flagged, every timeline mapped and annotated. She read the file for 25 minutes while I sat across from her. When she looked up, she said, "You prepared this yourself." I said, "It's what I do." She said, "Then you already understand what you have." I said, "I wanted a second perspective before I move forward." She said, "You have a fraud case. The forged signature on the original application alone is sufficient grounds for a criminal referral to the DA's office if you choose to pursue that path. The civil remedies are separate and significant." She looked at me directly. "We need to talk about your marriage." I said, "I know." She said, "Does your husband know?" I said, "I don't know yet. That's the next step." She nodded slowly. She said, "That answer matters enormously, both legally and personally, and you need to know it before anything else moves forward." I said, "I'm speaking to him this weekend." She said, "Call me Saturday evening regardless of how it goes." I said I would. I told James on a Saturday morning. We were at the kitchen table with coffee, in the particular unhurried ease of a weekend morning that I had always loved about our life together. The light came in the tall windows, and the coffee was good, and there was nowhere either of us needed to be for several hours. I put the file on the table between us, and I said, "I need to show you something." He looked at it with the mild attention of someone who has not yet registered that this is not a routine matter. He picked it up. He began to read. I watched his face with the full attention I bring to a client meeting when the information is sensitive and the reaction matters. I have, across 9 years of professional practice, become reasonably skilled at reading the difference between a face receiving information it already knew was coming and a face genuinely encountering something for the first time. James's face, as he read Francis's report and worked through the transaction history and reached the corporate registry, showing his mother's name and his sister's name on an LLC he had apparently never heard of, showed me the second thing: not performed surprise, actual surprise, moving through a person who was also processing, in real time, what the surprise meant about the 7 years preceding it. His color changed, his jaw set, and then released. He turned pages, he went back to earlier pages. He read certain sections twice. When he put the file down and looked at me, he looked like someone who had been handed a version of their own life that did not match the version they had been living and was trying to find the reconciliation point. He said, "How long have you known?" I said, "Just under 2 weeks." He said, "Why didn't you tell me immediately?" I said, "Because I needed the complete picture before I said anything, and because I needed to understand your role in it before I could know how to have this conversation." He went very still. He said my name. I said, "I know." I said, "I don't believe you were involved." But I had to establish that with documentation rather than assumption. That's not about trust, it's about accuracy. He said, "I was not involved in this." His voice was quiet with a heaviness I had not heard in it before. He said, "I promise you I did not know." I looked at him and I believed him. I also understood in the same moment with the particular clarity that comes when you have been sitting with something long enough for it to fully resolve, that believing him did not undo the 7 years. That his not knowing about the fraud did not account for the 7 years of "it's just a formality," and James's wife and the gap that had always been maintained between me and the full reality of his family. He had not known about the financial crime. He had known, at some level, about everything else. He had chosen, again and again, to smooth things over, to fill in my name with a light laugh, to let patterns continue because confronting them was more costly than absorbing them. The space between not knowing about the fraud and knowing about the rest of it was very large and was going to take a very long time to honestly examine. He put his hand over mine on the table. I let mine stay where it was, not moving toward him, not moving away, just present in the particular still way of someone who is choosing, deliberately, not to collapse the complexity of the moment into something simpler than it actually is. He called his mother that same week. I was not in the room. He told me afterward that the conversation had lasted 22 minutes and had moved through denial, then explanation, then the particular argument that I was overreacting, and that it had been family money, and that she had always intended to address it in her own time, and that I needed to understand how families worked, and that not everything required legal formality. He told me he had asked her one question, at the end, after all of that. He had asked her, did you use Claire's personal information, without her knowledge, to open an account in her name? She had not answered the question directly. She had said, James, you know how much I have always done for this family. He told me this sitting at our kitchen table the evening after the call, and I watched his face while he told it, and I saw what it cost him to say it clearly. He said, my mother did this. I said, yes. He said, I need you to understand that I did not know. I said, I do understand that. He looked at the table. He said, I also let a lot of other things go on longer than I should have. I said, yes. He said, I don't know how to begin fixing that. I said, we start with the truth being the baseline. Everything from here gets built on what's actually true. He nodded. We sat in our kitchen in a marriage that was still ours, but that needed to be rebuilt with different materials, more deliberately, and with much more honesty about the load-bearing elements. That kind of rebuilding is slow. It does not make for a clean or simple narrative. But I am an estate attorney. I have spent 9 years understanding that the documents which matter most are not the ones that announce beginnings. They are the ones that accurately record what is real, what was agreed, and what is owed. We were beginning from an accurate document now. That was, in the particular way of difficult things, a starting point. Harriet filed the civil claim in November. She named Margaret Whitfield and Carolyn Whitfield Chambers as respondents. The claim cited the fraudulent account application, the unauthorized use of my personal information, the forged signature, and the $81,000 in draws made against the fraudulently established credit line over 4 years. Frances submitted her full forensic report to the civil court. I also retained a document examiner, a man named Jeffrey Rains, who had been working in that field for 31 years, and whose testimony had been used in Pennsylvania courts on more than 200 occasions. He reviewed the signature on the original account application against 12 verified samples of my actual signature taken from documents across the preceding decade. His report was issued within 3 weeks. He identified 7 specific characteristics in which the signature on the application differed from my verified signatures in ways consistent with deliberate imitation. His conclusion was stated in the precise, unambiguous language that 31 years in a specialized field produces. The signature on the application was not written by the named account holder. He was very certain. He had been certain about things like this for a very long time. The credit bureaus were notified, and my file was flagged for review and correction. The fraudulent account was frozen pending investigation. I filed a report with the Philadelphia Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit and a separate complaint with the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office citing identity theft and financial fraud. Each of these filings required documentation I had already prepared. The system, once it had accurate information, moved in the direction accurate information tends to produce. Slowly, in the way civil and administrative proceedings are always slow, but steadily and in the right direction. I have been doing this work long enough to know that slow and steady in the right direction is not a failure of the process. It is the process working as designed, in a way that is resistant to pressure and resistant to the preferred narratives of the people who are subject to it. The 4 months between the civil filing and the settlement conference were their own particular experience. I saw Margaret twice in that period, at events that neither of us could entirely avoid, given the overlapping social world that a 7-year marriage creates. Both times, she looked at me with the expression I had seen her use across our entire marriage when she was assessing whether I was going to create a difficulty. The expression that said, "I am waiting to see if you blink first." I did not blink. I was not going to blink. The documents I had filed said everything I needed to say in the language that could not be revised by her preferred version of events, and I had nothing to add to them in social contexts. I smiled, exchanged brief pleasantries, and moved on. I was very good at moving on. I had spent 7 years practicing it in that family, and it turned out the skill had more than one application. The settlement conference was on a Thursday morning in February, in Harriet's conference room on the 14th floor of a building in Center City. Harriet and I on one side of the table, Margaret and Carolyn and their attorney, a man named Sullivan who had a reputation for aggressive negotiation in civil matters, on the other. I had been in that building hundreds of times for professional reasons. I had never been there for this particular reason. I sat down, opened my folder, and looked across the table at 2 women I had spent 7 years trying to belong to, and felt something I had not expected to feel in that moment, which was almost nothing. Not coldness, not anger, just the particular clarity that comes when you have finally arrived at the place where the truth gets to be official. Sullivan began with 3 arguments, delivered in sequence with the measured confidence of someone who has done this many times. The first was that the signature discrepancy on the original application was attributable to administrative error. Harriet presented Jeffrey Raines's report. Sullivan read it in full. He did not repeat that argument. The second was that the funds represented informal family borrowing with a reasonable expectation of repayment within the family structure. Harriet presented Francis's forensic report documenting the flow of funds through the LLC to personal spending accounts, including the $17,000 in discretionary personal purchases. That argument also did not survive contact with the documentation. The third was that no material harm had been done to my financial standing because the account had been maintained in good standing throughout its existence. Harriet presented 3 years of my credit reports, showing the hard inquiries generated by the fraudulent account during periods when I had been unaware of its existence and therefore unable to address them, along with documentation of the specific impact on my credit score during those periods. That argument did not survive either. Sullivan asked for a short recess. When they came back, the conversation changed character entirely. I will not detail the specific terms of the settlement publicly. What I will tell you is this. The outstanding balance on the fraudulent credit line was fully satisfied. My credit record was corrected completely and formally. The legal costs associated with the civil proceeding were addressed, and there was a signed, notarized document placed in the court record, formally acknowledging that the account had been opened without my knowledge or authorization using my personal information. Margaret signed it, in person, in that room, at that table, with me sitting across from her. She did not look at me when she signed. She looked at the document the way you look at something you are required to receive but have not yet decided to fully accept. Her attorney gathered the papers. Harriet gathered ours. Sullivan shook hands with Harriet and left. Carolyn left without speaking. Margaret stood to go and paused at the door. She did not fully turn around. She said, "I hope you understand that I did what I believed was right for this family." She said it in the particular register she had always used when she wanted a statement to land as final, as the last word on a matter she was choosing to close. I said, "I understand that you believe that." She left. The door closed. Harriet poured coffee from the carafe on the credenza and set a cup in front of me without asking. We sat in the conference room for a while after everyone else had gone, the two of us, in the particular quiet of a room where something that needed to happen has finally happened. Harriet said, "How are you doing?" I said, "I'm all right." She said, "You know that most people who come through this kind of proceeding spend a long time afterwards wondering if they should have seen it sooner." I looked out the window at Philadelphia going about its February, gray and cold and entirely indifferent to the specific human event that had just concluded on the 14th floor. I said, "I've spent time on that question." She said, "And," I said, "I've decided it's the wrong question. The question that matters is what you build on cleared ground." She nodded. She drank her coffee. I drank mine. After a while, I picked up my bag and my file and I took the elevator down to the street and walked back to my office in the particular way I walk when I have finished something that needed finishing and there is other work waiting. I want to tell you where things stand now, not because the story has a clean ending, but because I think you deserve the honest version rather than the satisfying one. James and I are still married. That is the result of a deliberate daily choice on both our parts, not a default position or an inertia we have settled into. We are in the process of building something more honest than what we had before, which means it is also more uncomfortable, because honesty between two people who have been living with significant gaps in it for 7 years is not a comfortable process. It requires looking at things you have not been looking at. It requires saying things you have arranged not to have to say. James has a better understanding now of how his family operated and of his own role in maintaining certain patterns within it, not as a conscious collaborator, but as someone who chose comfort over truth in ways that had real consequences for the person he had married. That understanding has not arrived all at once. It arrives in pieces, the way understanding usually does when you are examining something you spent a long time preferring not to examine. He is doing that work. I am doing my own version of the same work. Some days we are very good at it. Some days we are not. That is what the honest version looks like. Margaret and I have not spoken since the Thursday in February. I do not know what that means for the permanent shape of things. I know what it means for now, which is that for the first time in 7 years, I have a completely accurate understanding of my position in relation to this family, of what I am owed, of what I choose to give freely, and of what I will no longer allow to be taken from me without my knowledge. That understanding is built on documents that cannot be revised by anyone's preferred narrative. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, the thing I value most from everything that happened, more than the settlement, more than the corrected credit record, more than any single moment in the process. I know the truth now, the whole truth, properly documented, recorded in a system that is not subject to revision over dinner or at a garden committee or in the warm light of a Christmas kitchen. My mother came to visit us this spring after everything resolved. She sat at my kitchen table and I told her the shape of it. Not every detail, but enough. She listened the way she had always listened, completely and without rushing toward a verdict. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she reached across and put her hand over mine and said, "I'm glad you looked." I said, "I should have looked sooner." She said, "You looked when you could see." I sat with that for a while. She got up to put the kettle on. I looked out the window at the back garden James had planted with such care, the one in the house we had bought with the money I had saved across 8 years of careful work and my mother's Sunday evening notebook lessons. The roses were starting to come back. The ornamental grasses were catching the early spring light. The beds that had been bare through the winter were beginning to show what had been growing underneath, quietly and out of sight, in preparation for what came next. I have been an estate attorney for 9 years. I know that every document worth having is built on honest ground. That is true of wills and trusts and property agreements and every other form of contract I have spent my professional life working with. It is also true of marriages. What I am building now is the most important document of my life. I intend to read every single word of it. That is my story. 7 years, 1 line of credit, and the Tuesday morning in October when I finally sat down and looked at the paperwork. If this reminded you to read what you sign, to look at what you're told is a formality, to check whose name is really on the things you're carrying, take that as your sign. Do it this week, not because you suspect something, because you deserve to know. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.